The fundamental problems here is that these shock troops do not have legal authority. They do not have warrants. They do not have probable cause. And they do not have legal accountability. And until you deal with those problems, you have an authoritarian regime that is operating outside of the U.S. system the way that it's supposed to function.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin on the show. And just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on the Trump Report YouTube channel, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcast. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report again today.
Thank you so much, Maddie. A lot to chat about here.
A lot to discuss, and we're going to keep it pretty much domestic today. Now, what has happened is that the White House, the Border Patrol, ICE, they're under very serious scrutiny after the death of Alex Pretti, an ICU nurse who was employed by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. He was dragged to the ground by multiple immigration agents, shot dead after filming them while he was also trying to help a woman who had been shoved to the ground. Now, this took place on Saturday. Today is Tuesday, and Americans are furious about this, believing that the self-defense reasoning for killing Pretti is a lie by ICE. So, Scott, I want to get your thoughts on whether you think citizen journalists present during this federal immigration enforcement in South Minneapolis really caught the Trump administration in a lie with the amount of footage they got.
Absolutely, Maddie. I mean, that raises an obvious question. What if these people weren't there filming? How much could the Trump folks have gotten away with? But it also, Maddie, before I get into the details of it, it actually highlights why the demonstrators, they call themselves protectors of the communities in Minneapolis, why they are out there with those phones that are filming, even though the Trump people come out and say this is evidence that they are, quote, obstructing ICE and obstructing Border Patrol, which is absolutely false. The fundamental here is that after the killing of Renee Nicole Good a couple weeks ago, so that's the first killing in Minnesota, we've got multiple videos, including the administration putting out its own video from Jonathan Ryan, the man who killed her. There was just enough space in those videos for the administration to maintain the fiction that somehow she was actually aiming at Jonathan Ross, sorry, not Jonathan Ryan, that she was aiming at Jonathan Ross when he shot her. And that's because as she was turning away from Ross, he's got his hand on the car, right? He's balancing against it as he's slipping on the ice. She wasn't trying to ram him. He, in fact, fired 2 more shots into the driver's window as she passed by. But they had enough space that they could, skate that one, even though they have refused to investigate that killing. And instead are tried to investigate Renee Good until a judge told them she's dead. And then they're investigating Becca Good, her partner. So they got away with that one, to be honest with you, as horrible as that killing was. In the case of Alex Pretti, on Saturday, immediately after 10 shots are fired into him on the ground, Kristi Noem comes out, the Homeland Security Secretary, and says that he was a domestic terrorist, just like Renee Good, threatening these officers. Stephen Miller, who's the key advisor here on this crackdown, Stephen Miller comes out and says he was a would-be assassin. Now, the multiple videos come out, and this time the Trump folks can't escape. Because as you've described it quite well, although Alex Pretti has a gun, which he has a legal permit to carry, it's in his waistband. When he's observing the officers, camera in one hand, other hand empty. When he intervenes, because the woman who was observer was not only being assaulted, she was being pepper sprayed by ICE and Border Patrol. As they knock him to the ground, he's got the phone in one hand. He's trying to keep himself going up with the left hand extended to the ground. But he hits the ground. They take the firearm off of him, the gun that he had off of him. No threat whatsoever. And seconds after that, 1 shot, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Maddie, the video show an execution. And I know what that word means. Not just killing, an execution. In that you had a defenseless man who posed no threat to the officers, and they took him out in cold blood. Now, at that point, the Trump folks were exposed because now they have not been able to drag up. They say they're going over body cam footage of the agents who were there in the area, but they haven't been able to come up with anything else to try to steal the narrative back or to confuse the narrative. That meant that you had, of course, public opinion, including some people who are the Trump folks. Trump is saying, look, we're not sure we like what's going on here. It's compounded by the fact that Kash Patel, the FBI director, on Sunday comes out and says, well, you know, he was carrying a gun to a protest. That's illegal. Now, first of all, that's flatly wrong. You can legally have a gun at a protest in the United States. I'm not actually happy about that. That's part of the reason why I live over here. But you can legally do that in the States. But secondly, it was almost as if Kash Patel was saying, well, because he happened to have a gun on him, it was absolutely justified that he was killed. That brought out the National Rifle Association against Trump. Now, once you've got groups who normally support Trump who come out after him, you clearly have certain Republican legislators who don't like Trump anyway. And so they were the first group to break with Trump. You know, you're talking about Tom Tillis, North Carolina, who is retiring, the senator, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, who have not been big fans of Trump. But then you had Bill Cassidy come out from Louisiana, pretty senior figure in the Senate, who Trump has threatened to primary, right? So he's taken a risk here. And then there are like 2-3 other senators who have joined. And now Rand Paul, the libertarian, has come out and said there has to be we need to investigate these agencies, right? And at the same time, there are members of the House, and there weren't a huge Republican members of the House, but there were 2 that were key. One is Representative Comer, who normally is a diehard defender of the Trump administration. He even had hearings a few weeks ago trying to attack the Minnesota leadership over the fraud issue. But this time he says, we need to consider getting ICE out of Minnesota, redeploy it somewhere else. And then Representative Garbarino, who's head of the House Homeland Security Committee, has said, I want the heads of the agencies, Kristi Noem, Tom Homan, head of ICE, Gregory Bavino, head of Border Patrol. I want them to testify. So he was going to call them up to the Hill. A lot of other Republicans have not come out and criticized the Trump folks, but they were waiting to see which way the wind blows. And that's why I think Trump makes the move on Monday night, which is to say, oh yeah, we'll investigate. Yeah. But then he calls Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota. He calls Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis. And remember, he has called for these people to be prosecuted before. He's now reached out to them and said, let's talk. And both Frey and Walz have said, okay, that the possibility here is that federal authorities may now cooperate with state and local authorities, both on the day-to-day situation, but also on the prospect of an investigation of the Pretti killing.
Well, Scott, before I get into the Republicans coming out and publicly condemning this, I do want to get your thoughts now, just for the audience. Yes, Donald Trump on Monday night, he called Tim Walz, the Minnesota governor. They both said that it was a productive phone call. Walz pressed Trump on the fact that there needs to be independent investigations into the shooting. He also asked for a reduction in the number of federal immigration agents operating in the state. Trump agreed to review the case and considered allowing Minnesota state investigators to be involved, and said that DHS officials would directly coordinate with Walz on the next steps going forward. He also said he was bringing in his border czar, Tom Homan, to Minnesota. But I wonder, these steps of Trump calling Walz, agreeing to what he wants out of this, is that Trump backing down in the aftermath of so much backlash?
I think it's, and when I say Trump, I mean the Trump camp, okay? I don't think Trump's the driver here, right? Of course, he'll go after to try to display, his power over immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers. He'll send the shock troops in. There are others like J.D. Vance and especially Stephen Miller, the advisor, who are key here. I think they're buying a bit of time. I think they're on the defensive. They're on the defensive because they've been caught out in the lie. They're on the defensive because now there's certain legislators who want to act against that, and because of timing. Because at the end of this week, the U.S. government has to extend its funding or it shuts down. Now, it just so happens that one of the bills to keep the U.S. government going was the funding of 6 agencies. One of them is ICE. And what Democrats were saying is, look, we'll fund the other 5 agencies, but we don't want to fund ICE here. You've got question marks over what's going to happen regarding their accountability. And that they got leverage now because of the reaction to the execution. They've got leverage. So all of that has meant that the Trump folks need to get past the end of this week. I think where the rubber hits the road here, Maddie, is first of all whether we do get a meaningful investigation. Because I mean, I will repeat, after the killing of Renee Nicole Good, it was shocking in that the scene of the killing was not secured, and that Jonathan Ross, the killer, was able with colleagues to just simply flee the scene. And we do not know where he is now, right? So they've escaped that. And then the FBI and the Justice Department refused to hand over any information to state and local authorities. Now, they took the same line this time after the killing of Alex Pretti on Saturday. And that is, they didn't secure the scene properly. The agents who carried out the killing are still in service. They have not been suspended, according to the Trump White House. They've been redeployed. And of course, you've had the attempt to prejudge any investigation by smearing the name of Pretti. Now, do they actually pull that back? Second question that we're watching, Maddie, on it: how many ICE and Border Patrol agents do they pull out of Minnesota? I mean, quick reminder, they sent in 3,000 ICE agents. The entire Minneapolis Uniform Police Force has 600 people. So, that's the size of the scale of this invasion force that they sent in. So, Trump, he gets, the thing is, even as he says this, you can see the other attempt by the Trump camp to stay on the offensive here. And that is that there was a wobble in their outlets over the weekend, including Fox, which was like, oh gosh, maybe the video footage doesn't stand up here, right? By yesterday, Fox and other Trump outlets are on this assault thing, which is, this is all the fault of Tim Walz, right? Now, they may have to back off now after the call, but this is the fault of radical left agitators who are from outside Minnesota. Now, that line, there are so many expletives I could use for that line. It is the people who are there observing ICE, observing what Border Patrol doing, are effectively neighborhood watch groups. They've been trained in some cases for up to a year. Robert Worth has a great article in the New Yorker about it that came out, or Atlantic, I should say, came out yesterday. Trump folks are trying to smear these protesters as being the real threat here, including by the point of saying, oh, they're being funded by people like, Open Society, George Soros' folks, right? How can they get away with that type of disinformation to say the threat continues here and it's Minnesotans who are the threat? So we've got to keep ICE and Border Patrol in. Because I will give you the line, Maddie, and I've used it a couple of interviews elsewhere, but I'm here, I want to feature it here for you. The thing about an authoritarian regime, and this is an authoritarian regime, and Minnesota is an example, is when you operate without legal authority, when you operate without legal accountability, when you don't care about legal accountability, you cannot retreat. If you retreat, you accept that others have agency. They have influence. State and local authorities have something to say. The courts have something to say. And then you start to box yourself in. And I've watched Stephen Miller for years, and I would be very, very surprised if he takes his foot off the gas. They've just got to find a new pretext for continuing to send the shock troops in.
Well, on the note of Stephen Miller, Scott, before this phone call between Donald Trump and Tim Walz, there had been a lot of mixed messaging coming from the Trump camp. So as you mentioned, Kristi Noem had called it domestic terrorism, referring to Pretti. Stephen Miller said something of the sorts as well. But then Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, he said that Alex Pretti's actions did not meet the legal definition of domestic terrorism when he was questioned about the fallout from the shooting. So there is mixed messaging coming from the Trump camp, but I don't know if it's a complete comparison, Scott, but how can the Trump White House come out and say and protect those protesting in Iran and then carry out what's happened here in Minnesota?
Absolute snap. And actually, in an earlier interview this morning, I actually went into that Iran case because some of your viewers may know I cover Iran on a day-to-day basis. So we were just coming out of these protests, this horrible story about how on January 8th, after the protests were in about the 10th or 11th day, they were becoming a real threat to the Iranian regime. So the Iranian regime cut off the internet, and then they unleashed not just police, they unleashed their military forces, and thousands of Iranians died over the next 2 days. We don't know the exact toll. That's how bad it's gotten. Now, the pretext for them using it, to make the comparison even more appropriate to what we're talking about now, is they said that those people who are demonstrating and protesting are not legitimate. They said they're controlled by the U.S. and Israel, by radical outside forces, right? So I'm reading headlines yesterday about the Trump narrative, right? About, that their actions, these security forces, are justified because of the threats on the ground. And I had to look, and some of the people who told me later, who read my stuff, they had to look, were they talking about Iran or the United States, right? And the fact here is that you have an authoritarian regime in Iran, happens to be led by a supreme leader, by a cleric, rather than by someone who was elected. But they used the tactics that they are defending themselves. Their security forces are defending themselves against those who are protesting. Same tactics that you use if you're the Trump administration, just that Donald Trump doesn't wear a turban. Donald Trump wears a big red tie and says that this is all for Make America Great Again.
And I want to get your thoughts on whether the White House is panicking, Scott, because reportedly Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino, who's been carrying out this situation in Minnesota, has reportedly been removed from his role. Now, he's not fired, he's not sacked, but he's reportedly been taken out of Minnesota, taken back to California, and allegedly locked out of his social media accounts by the DHS because he'd been trolling various Republicans and Democrats. And then on top of that, various publications, I think a few are reporting that Kristi Noem's job is at risk as well. So I wonder whether you think these two actually might get sacked, or whether that's too bad of PR for Trump and his immigration policies.
But Vino's been redeployed. They will not, they denied he was sacked, and they're hard on deny it. You can't take a step back. If Bovino had been sacked, it's a big, so they've redeployed. They've put in Tom Homan, who's the head of ICE, who was also head of ICE during the Obama years. But Tom Homan's rhetoric is just as hardline as any of them, especially in what he's done in recent weeks in terms of smearing the Somali community in Minnesota, which is the pretext for this operations, in terms of attacking the so-called radical left as being the supposed threat here. So just simply moving Bovino out, and Bovino was moved out because he made bad PR with some of the images. He was being compared to General Patton from World War II, the way that he was strutting about. And then he filmed himself, or he had himself filmed throwing tear gas at the protectors, right? As if this was a great thing to do. He just crossed the line in terms, especially when he was smearing Alex Pretti. And it got to the point on Sunday when he was asked to say something about the victim. And he said, oh, I will. Border Patrol are the victims. Okay. So you just changed the face at the head of the operation. Kristi Noem's a more interesting case, because Noem was in there as she's almost like Trump's attack dog, right? To go after it. But she went too far with the line that got caught out as a lie. So she may have to be the sacrifice. She had a 2-hour meeting with Trump last night in the White House, right? White House still says the job is safe. I think they're going to read the mood music here. I think if Republican men and congresswomen want to sacrifice, she's the one that gets thrown to them. But that doesn't mean that they've retreated completely, because who replaces Kristi Noem, first of all, right? And by the way, there's a bit of bad blood within the administration, because her partner reportedly is Corey Lewandowski, who's a former Trump campaign manager, who was brought in as a special assistant, who should no longer be there. His time has expired there. He doesn't play nice with anyone. That's by the by. She may be sacrificed, but who replaces her? And if you want, I will believe they retreat if Stephen Miller is sacked. Okay? I believe they will retreat if J.D. Vance apologizes for the statements he made over the weekend before Alex Pretti was killed about how law enforcement had to go after these radical leftists. That's a sign that they're retreating. Until then, no. The problem is remember with the National Guard, Maddie, that they went into California and they went into Washington? They could go in there for a few weeks, then they could come back out and have the false narrative about, oh yeah, we solved all the crime problem, which is rubbish, but they could say that. Stakes are too high now. They can't just simply pull ICE out of here and say, oh yeah, we solved the problem, because they created the damn problem. So I'm not sure how they get out of this if they play defense. And that makes me worried, Maddie, that they'll keep trying to play offense. And so you have to continue to be vigilant.
And if Kristi Noem is sacrificed, like you say, Scott, it does remind me of the Mike Waltz situation when he was sacrificed after the Signalgate drama. But just a final question for you, because you mentioned how Republicans are veering away from the MAGA movement and veering away from this, what's happening with these ICE raids and what happened over the weekend. You mentioned Thomas Massey. He said that carrying a firearm was not a death sentence. There's various other Republicans, even former Vice President Mike Pence. He tweeted that the images of this incident are deeply troubling and a full and transparent investigation of this officer involved in the shooting must take place immediately. But as you mentioned at the start of this interview, Scott, I think the big takeaway is seeing Rand Paul immediately send letters to the heads of ICE, CBP, the US Citizen and Immigration Services, requesting that they testify before the Homeland Security Committee in February. So just a final answer from you on that. Is that significant to see diehard MAGA Republican Rand Paul, of course, he's veered away from Trump in the last few months, send off these letters demanding they testify?
It's got to be more than Paul, Maddie, because Paul, people will read Paul as a libertarian, not even a straight line Republican. And of course, he's opposed Trump on numerous other issues. It's got to be more people. Paul might be, we have the old phrase in UK politics about the stalking horse who makes the first challenge, and then you get the heavy hitters that come in behind. You've got to see people like John Toome, the Senate Majority Leader, come in and say, yeah, I think this is worthwhile. Or you've got to have a couple other committee heads come in. But again, it's possible, because remember I mentioned also that that's not the only call for an investigation. So that's the Senate Homeland Security Committee. But you've got Representative Garbarino on the Homeland Security Committee in the House, who's making the same call. I think we watch over the next 48, 72 hours. If the problem, my worry here, Maddie, is that, there's a couple of token moves by the Trump folks, including possibly getting rid of Noem, and then the temperature dies down, and then they feel like they can maintain this deployment in Minnesota, or they can carry out a deployment somewhere else. I'm just going to repeat the fundamental. The fundamental problems here is that these shock troops do not have legal authority. They do not have warrants. They do not have probable cause. And they do not have legal accountability. And until you deal with those problems, you have an authoritarian regime that is operating outside of the U.S. system the way that it's supposed to function.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you so much, Maddie.